The iron shackles bit into Ophelia's wrists as the massive cowboy dragged her from the back of his wagon like a sack of grain. At 6'8", with shoulders broader than a barn door, Caspian Ironwood cast a shadow that swallowed her entire frame. His storm-gray eyes held all the warmth of a winter grave as he hauled her toward the sprawling ranch house that would become her prison. "Move faster," his voice rumbled like distant thunder, giving her bound hands a sharp jerk when she stumbled on the rocky ground. Ophelia's bare feet found purchase on the dusty earth, her tattered dress catching on thorns as she struggled to match his impossible stride. 3 days ago, she'd been tending her dying mother in their one-room shack outside Willow Creek. Now her mother lay buried in pauper's ground. Ophelia found herself sold to pay off debts she'd never known existed. "Mr. Ironwood," she gasped, her voice hoarse from crying, "please. There's been some mistake." His massive hand clamped around her upper arm, fingers easily encircling her slender limb. "The only mistake would be thinking I care about your sob story. You belong to me now, same as my cattle and horses." The ranch sprawled across the valley like a small kingdom, with endless acres of grassland dotted by grazing herds. The main house stood 3 stories tall, built from local stone and timber, imposing as a fortress. Smoke curled from multiple chimneys, and Ophelia caught glimpses of movement behind lace-curtained windows. Caspian kicked open the front door with his boot, dragging her into a grand foyer that spoke of wealth beyond her imagination. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, casting rainbow patterns across polished hardwood floors. Persian rugs covered the space between carved furniture that cost more than her family had earned in a lifetime. "Millicent," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. A stern-faced woman in her 50s appeared, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and her black dress crisp as fresh laundry. Her sharp blue eyes took in Ophelia's disheveled state with obvious disapproval. "This is the new girl," Millicent Ashford said, her voice clipped with authority. "She looks half dead." "Shtu," Caspian replied curtly, finally releasing Ophelia's arm. "Put her in the servants' quarters. She starts work at dawn." "What kind of work?" Ophelia asked, though she dreaded the answer. Caspian's laugh held no humor. "Whatever I tell you to do. You'll clean, cook, tend the animals, mend fences, anything that needs doing. And you'll do it without complaint, or you'll learn why they call me the Iron Fist of Devil's Canyon." Ophelia's chin lifted in defiance despite her desperate circumstances. "I'm not a slave. This is America's slavery was abolished." The back of Caspian's hand struck her cheek with enough force to send her stumbling backward.
"Oh."
Stars exploded across her vision as the taste of blood filled her mouth. "You're whatever I say you are," he snarled, looming over her like a mountain. "And right now, you're mine. Property. Nothing more." Millicent stepped forward, her expression softening slightly as she saw the bright red handprint blooming across Ophelia's pale cheek. "Come along, girl. Let's get you cleaned up and fed." As they climbed the narrow back stairs to the servants' quarters, Ophelia caught her reflection in a hallway mirror. Her chestnut hair hung in tangled waves around a face marked by exhaustion and fresh bruising. But her amber eyes still burned with unbroken spirit. "That man is a monster," she whispered. Millicent paused on the stairs, glancing back nervously. "He wasn't always," she said quietly. "But monsters aren't born, child. They're made. Mr. Caspian has had more reasons than most to build walls around his heart." Ophelia touched her throbbing cheek, feeling the heat of his handprint still burning there. Whatever had made Caspian Ironwood into the cold, brutal man he'd become, she refused to let it break her. She had no idea that her very presence in his house had already begun to crack the ice around his frozen heart. Dawn came, too early and too cold. Ophelia woke to Millicent shaking her shoulder, the older woman's face grim in the pale morning light filtering through her tiny window. "Up, girl. Mr. Caspian wants his breakfast in 20 minutes, and he doesn't tolerate lateness." Body protested every movement as she dressed in the plain brown dress Millicent had provided. Her cheek throbbed where Caspian had struck her, the bruise now a deep purple that made her wince when she touched it. The kitchen was a cavernous room, with a massive stone fireplace and enough cast iron cookware to outfit a small army. Millicent moved with practiced efficiency, showing Ophelia where everything was kept, while explaining Caspian's exacting standards. Eggs over easy, never runny. Bacon crisp, but not burned. Coffee strong enough to wake the dead. And God help you if the biscuits are anything less than perfect. Ophelia had cooked for her mother countless times, but never under such pressure. Her hands shook as she cracked eggs into the heavy iron skillet, praying they wouldn't break. The bacon sizzled and popped, sending tiny droplets of grease onto her arms. "Where's everyone else?" she asked, noticing the unusual quiet of such a large house. Millicent's face darkened. "There is no one else. Haven't been for 3 years, not since she caught herself." Glancing toward the dining room, "Just focus on the food." Caspian's heavy footsteps announced his arrival before he appeared in the kitchen doorway, filling the frame completely. In daylight, he was even more imposing, broad, chest straining against a blue work shirt, dark hair touched with premature gray at the temples, and those cold storm eyes that seemed to look right through her. "Is my breakfast ready?" His voice held the same chill as the morning air. "Yes, sir," Ophelia replied. Quickly plating his food with trembling hands, she carried the plate to the dining room, acutely aware of his presence behind her, like a looming thundercloud. The dining room was as grand as the rest of the house. The table that could seat 20 and paintings of stern-faced ancestors watching from gilded frames. Caspian sat at the head of the table, his massive frame making the ornate chair look almost delicate. He cut into his eggs with surgical precision, chewed thoughtfully, then set down his fork with a sharp clink against the china. "The eggs are overcooked, the bacon is underdone, and these biscuits." He picked one up and crumbled it between his fingers, letting the pieces fall to his plate, are hard as rocks. Ophelia's heart sank. "I'm sorry, I can. You'll do better tomorrow, or you'll go without food yourself. Now clear this away and muck out the stables." Stable work was backbreaking. Ophelia had never handled a pitchfork before, and her soft hands quickly developed painful blisters. The horses, magnificent beasts, worth more than most people's houses, watched her with intelligent eyes as she cleaned their stalls. "You're doing it wrong," came Caspian's voice from behind her. She spun around to find him leaning against the stable door. His arms crossed over his broad chest. Even relaxed, he radiated an aura of barely contained power that made her pulse quicken with fear. "I'm trying my best. Your best isn't good enough." He stepped into the stall, his presence making the already tight space feel suffocating. "Here." Massive hands covered hers on the pitchfork handle, and Ophelia gasped at the unexpected contact. His skin was rough with calluses, warm despite his cold demeanor, and she caught a scent of leather and pine that was purely masculine. "Like this," he said, guiding her movements to show the proper technique. Efficient, clean, no wasted motion. For a moment, Ophelia forgot to be afraid. His voice had lost its harsh edge, becoming almost instructional. She found herself studying his profile, the straight nose, the way his dark lashes cast shadows on his cheekbones. Then he stepped back abruptly, as if her nearness had burned him. "Finish the rest yourself. And don't think this kindness will be repeated." But as he stalked away, Ophelia caught something in his expression, a flicker of something warmer than ice. Gone so quickly she might have imagined it that night as she soaked her blistered hands in cold water. Millicent sat beside her with a cup of chamomile tea. "He taught you the proper way," the older woman observed. "He did." Ophelia stared out the small window at the star-filled sky. "Millicent, what happened to him? What made him so cold?" Millicent was quiet for so long that Ophelia thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above. A whisper. "He loved someone once, loved her more than life itself, and when she died, she took the best part of him with her." The second week brought a terrible storm that lashed the valley with wind and rain. Ophelia huddled in her small room, listening to thunder crack like gunshots overhead while lightning illuminated her tiny window in brilliant flashes. She'd grown accustomed to the brutal routine cooking, cleaning, tending animals, enduring Caspian's cold criticism, but tonight felt different, dangerous. A sound from downstairs made her freeze, not thunder, something else. A crash followed. By a man's voice raised in anguish, against every instinct screaming at her to stay hidden, Ophelia crept down the servants' stairs. The sound came again, and she realized it was coming from Caspian's study. Through the partially open door, she glimpsed him standing before the massive stone fireplace, a shattered whiskey bottle at his feet. "Serafina," he whispered to the flames, his voice broken in a way she'd never heard. "God, why couldn't I save you?" Ophelia's breath caught. He was talking to someone who wasn't there, his massive frame shaking with grief that seemed to tear him apart from the inside. Lightning flashed again, and in its stark light, she saw tears streaming down his rugged face. He grabbed another bottle from his desk, this one nearly empty, and raised it to his lips with desperate need. That's when Ophelia noticed the portrait. Above the mantel, beautiful woman with golden hair and gentle blue eyes, her smile radiating warmth and love. The bottle slipped from Caspian's trembling hands, crashing to the floor in another explosion of glass. He sank into his leather chair like a man defeated, burying his face in his hands while his shoulders shook with silent sobs. Ophelia found herself moving before she could think, stepping into the study despite every rational thought telling her to flee. "Mr. Ironwood?" His head snapped up, those storm-gray eyes wild with pain and fury. "Get out," he snarled, his voice raw. "Get out before you what? Hit me again?" Ophelia surprised herself with her boldness. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." It was a lie, but something in his broken state made her feel protective rather than threatened. This wasn't the cold, brutal master who dragged her here in chains. This was a man drowning in grief so profound it had poisoned everything good in him. "You should be afraid," he said, but the menace had gone out of his voice. I'm not a good man, Ophelia." Hearing her name on his lips sent an unexpected shiver through her. In 3 weeks, he'd never once called her anything but girl or you. "Who was she?" Ophelia asked softly, nodding toward the portrait. Caspian's gaze followed hers to the painting, and his face crumpled with fresh pain. "My wife, Serafina." His voice broke on her name. "She died 3 years ago. Cholera took her and our unborn child both." The revelation hit Ophelia like a physical blow. No wonder he'd become a monster. Grief that deep could destroy a man's soul. "I'm sorry," she whispered, meaning it completely. "Are you?" His laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You should be celebrating." The great Caspian Ironwood brought low. "By a woman's love." "Love isn't weakness," Ophelia said, surprising them both. "It's the strongest thing in the world. Strong enough to break a man, yes, but also strong enough to remake him." Caspian stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Blood trickled from a cut on his hand where he'd gripped broken glass, but he seemed unaware of the wound. Without thinking, Ophelia moved closer, pulling a clean handkerchief from her apron pocket. "You're bleeding." "Don't," he said, but made no move to stop her as she carefully wrapped the cloth around his injured hand. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, and she felt him tremble at her gentle touch. When she looked up, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite re-surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hunger. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because everyone deserves kindness," Ophelia replied simply. "Even broken people? Especially broken people." For a moment, the ice in his eyes seemed to thaw, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been before grief consumed him. Then he pulled his hand away, as if her touch had burned him. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Go back to your room now." Ophelia hesitated, wanting to say more, to somehow reach through the walls he'd built around his heart. But the storm outside chose that moment to send a tree crashing against the house, and Caspian's protective instincts took over. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, moving to shield her from the flying debris as windows rattled in their frames. The concern in his voice was unmistakable. And Ophelia realized that despite his cruelty, despite everything, Caspian Ironwood was still capable of caring about another person's well-being. It was a crack in his armor, small but significant, and Ophelia intended to widen it. The morning after the storm revealed a changed landscape. Trees lay uprooted across the yard. The barn roof had partially collapsed, and debris scattered the normally pristine grounds like broken bones. Ophelia woke to find Caspian already gone, his thunderous voice carrying from outside as he directed cleanup efforts. Millicent, Ophelia said as they surveyed the damage from the kitchen window. Where are all his ranch hands? Surely he can't manage this place alone. The older woman's face tightened. He dismissed them all after Miss Serafina died. Said he didn't want people around anymore. Didn't trust anyone. She paused, watching Caspian single-handedly lift a fallen beam that should have required 3 men. Truth is, I think he was afraid of caring about anyone again. Ophelia spent the morning cooking for the small crew of day laborers Caspian had reluctantly hired for the cleanup. She watched him through the window as he worked, his massive frame moving with surprising grace despite his size. Sweat dampened, his shirt revealing the powerful muscles beneath. And more than once, she caught herself staring, around midday. She carried water to the workers, including a fresh pitcher specifically for Caspian. She found him in the damaged barn, attempting to repair a support beam alone. You need help, she said, setting the water nearby. I need you to mind your own business, he replied without looking at her. But she noticed he reached for the water immediately. This is dangerous work for one person. Everything's dangerous. His hammer strikes punctuated each word. Life is dangerous. Our love is dangerous. Caring about people, the hammer slipped, nearly catching his thumb. Damn it! Let me help, Ophelia said, moving closer despite his warning glare. You'll just get in the way. I'm stronger than I look. She positioned herself at the other end of the beam he was trying to maneuver. My father was a carpenter before he died. I know something about building. For a moment, Caspian looked like he might refuse. Then practicality won over stubbornness. And he nodded curtly. Fine, but follow my lead exactly. They worked in tense silence at first, but gradually fell into a rhythm. Ophelia proved surprisingly capable with tools, and her smaller size allowed her to reach places Caspian couldn't fit. Despite himself, he began explaining the finer points of construction, his voice losing some of its harsh edge. Has to bear the weight evenly, he said, showing her how to position the crossbeam. One weak point, and the whole structure fails. Like people, Ophelia murmured, then blushed when she realized she'd spoken aloud. Caspian's hand stilled on the... What did you say? Nothing. She took a breath, gathering courage. I said like people. We're all carrying weights, and sometimes we need support to keep from collapsing. His storm-gray eyes studied her face with uncomfortable intensity. What weight? Are you carrying, Ophelia? The question caught her off guard. No one had asked about her burdens, and she couldn't remember how long. Grief, I suppose. For my mother, for the life I lost. Fear about what comes next. She met his gaze steadily. What about you? You know what I carry. His voice was rough with emotion. You saw it last night. Guilt, Ophelia said softly. You carry guilt along with the grief. You blame yourself for her death. Caspian's face went white, then flushed with anger. You don't know anything about... I know you loved her, Ophelia interrupted, surprising them both with her boldness. I know losing her broke something inside you. But I also know that turning yourself into a monster dishonors her memory. The hammer fell from Caspian's hand, clattering to the barn floor. For a moment, Ophelia thought he might strike her again. Instead, he sank onto a hay bale, his massive frame suddenly looking defeated. She was everything good in me, he whispered. When she died, the goodness died too. All that's left is... Ophelia moved closer, her heart aching for his pain. That's not true. I've seen flashes of who you really are. When you taught me to use the pitchfork properly. When you were concerned about my safety during the storm. The goodness isn't gone. Caspian it's just buried under all that hurt. He looked up at her then, and she saw tears threatening in those steel-gray eyes. How can you be so kind to me? After everything I've done to you? 'Cause kindness is a choice, Ophelia said simply. And I choose to see the man you could be again, not just the monster you've become. For a long moment, they stared at each other in the dusty barn, something electric passing between them. Then Caspian reached out with trembling fingers to touch the fading bruise on her cheek, the mark he'd left there. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "God, Ophelia, I'm so sorry." The apology she'd never expected to hear broke something loose in her chest. Before she could stop herself, she covered his hand with hers, feeling the warmth of his palm against her skin. "I forgive you," she said, and meant it completely. Caspian's breath caught, and for just a moment, the ice around his heart cracked a little wider. 3 days after their moment in the barn, Caspian began to change in small, but noticeable ways. He still spoke curtly and maintained his distance, but the casual cruelty disappeared. Ophelia's meals went uncriticized, even when they were imperfect. He stopped finding fault with her work for the sake of finding fault. More telling were the things he didn't say. When she struggled with a heavy bucket of water, he appeared silently to take it from her hands. When her old shoes finally fell apart completely, new boots appeared outside her expensive leather ones that fit perfectly. When she asked Millicent about them, the older woman just smiled knowingly. "He's fighting it," Millicent observed. One afternoon, as they watched Caspian through the kitchen window, he was teaching Ophelia how to properly saddle his enormous black stallion, Goliath, standing closer than necessary to guide her hands. "Fighting the way he feels, how I feel." Ophelia's cheeks warmed. "I don't know what you mean, child." "Have eyes? You look at that man like he hung the moon, and he looks at you like you're the sun itself." Millicent's expression grew serious. "But he's terrified of loving again. Terrified of losing someone else." That evening, Ophelia was gathering eggs in the chicken coop when she heard voices approaching, Caspian's deep rumble and another man's higher tone. Through the wooden slats, she saw her master speaking with a well-dressed stranger who looked distinctly out of place on the ranch. "The offer stands, Ironwood," the stranger was saying. 50,000 for the girl? My clients in San Francisco pay premium prices for exotic beauties." Ophelia's blood turned to ice. They were discussing selling her not as a servant, but for something far worse. "She's not for sale, Pemberton." Caspian's voice was dangerously quiet. "Everything's for sale at the right price." 60,000 then? That's more than this entire ranch is worth." I said no. The menace in Caspian's tone could have melted steel. 75,000. Final offer. "Think about it, man, you could buy 10 ranches with that money." What's one little dove worth compared to the sound of Pemberton hitting the ground cut off his words? Ophelia peered through a gap in the boards to see Caspian standing over the fallen man, his massive fists clenched. "The lady is not for sale. At any price," Caspian snarled. "If I see you on my land again, I'll bury you in it. I'll get out before I forget I'm a gentleman." Pemberton scrambled to his feet, his face bloody and his fancy clothes covered in dust. "You're making a mistake, Ironwood. That girl's just a servant. She means nothing." "She means everything," Caspian roared, and the raw emotion in his voice made Ophelia's heart skip. "Now get out." Pemberton fled to his carriage, whipping his horses into a frantic gallop. Caspian stood in the yard for a long moment, his chest heaving with fury and something deeper. When he finally turned toward the house, his eyes met Ophelia's. Through the chicken coop window, he'd known she was there the whole time. Later that night, Ophelia found him on the front porch, sitting in the darkness, with a bottle of whiskey at his feet and opened this time. She approached carefully, unsure of her welcome. "You heard?" he said without looking at her. "I heard." She settled into the chair beside him, noting how his massive frame seemed to dwarf the sturdy wooden furniture. "Thank you. For what?" "Protecting my property?" The casual words stung, but Ophelia caught the pain underlying them. "Is that all I am to you? Property?" Caspian was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "No, that's the problem." Ophelia's pulse quickened. "What am I then?" He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight, his eyes held a vulnerability that took her breath away. "The first person to make me feel alive since Serafina died. You're the first person to show me kindness when I deserve nothing but hatred. He swallowed hard. "You're dangerous as hell to a man trying to stay dead inside." "Maybe staying dead inside isn't living at all," Ophelia said softly. Maybe not. His hand moved across the space between their chairs, his fingers barely brushing. Hers, but coming back to life means risking everything again. It's risking the pain of losing someone who matters. Ophelia turned her hand palm up, letting their fingers intertwine. His hand was so much larger than hers, calloused and scarred from years of hard work, but his touch was infinitely gentle. "Some things are worth the risk," she whispered. Caspian lifted their joined hands, pressing his lips to her knuckles, in a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "You're worth any risk," he admitted. "That's what terrifies me." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the stars wheel overhead. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Ophelia felt truly safe. Not because of walls or locks, but because of the man beside Hertha, man who was finally allowing himself to feel again. The ice around Caspian Ironwood's heart was melting, one drop at a time. The transformation began in earnest the next morning. Ophelia woke to find Caspian in the kitchen with Millicent, both of them looking expectant as she appeared in her simple brown work dress. "There are packages for you upstairs," Millicent said, her eyes twinkling with barely contained excitement. "Mr. Caspian thought you might like some proper clothes." Ophelia's gaze flew to Caspian, who was suddenly very interested in his coffee cup. "I don't need you do," he said quietly, finally meeting her eyes. "A woman like you shouldn't be dressed in servant's rags." In her room, she found 3 beautiful dresses laid out on her bed, a deep green one that would match her eyes, a soft blue like summer sky, and a rich burgundy that made her breath catch. There were also new undergarments, stockings, and a pair of delicate slippers that looked like they belonged on a princess. When she came downstairs in the green dress, Caspian's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips, and he stared at her with such naked admiration that her cheeks flushed pink. "Beautiful," he murmured, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, the dress fits well." "Thank you," Ophelia said, smoothing the soft fabric over her hips. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned." "You make it beautiful," Caspian replied, then stood abruptly. "I have work to do." But his work seemed to involve staying unusually close to the house that day. When Ophelia hung laundry, he found fence repairs that needed doing nearby. When she tended the vegetable garden, he discovered issues with the barn that required his immediate attention. Issues that gave him a perfect view of her kneeling among the tomato plants. That afternoon, he approached her while she was reading. In the parlor, another new privilege he'd quietly granted her. "Would you like to see more of the ranch?" he asked, his voice carefully casual. "There are parts you haven't explored yet." They rode out together on his gentlest horses, Caspian, leading her through valleys she'd never seen. The land was breathtaking, rolling hills covered in wildflowers, crystal streams that reflected the clouds, and vistas that stretched to the distant mountains. "It's magnificent," Ophelia breathed as they paused at a high overlook. "Used to love this spot," Caspian said, his voice thoughtful rather than pained. She said you could see forever from here. It was the first time he'd mentioned his late wife without that look of raw agony crossing his face. Ophelia took it as a hopeful sign. "She had good taste," Ophelia said carefully. "She did." He was quiet for a moment, then continued. "She would have liked you, I think. You have the same strength she did, the same kindness." They talked as they rode, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Caspian told her about building the ranch with his father, about the challenges of running such a vast operation alone. Ophelia spoke of her mother's gentle wisdom, her father's carpentry skills, the books she'd loved to read when work was done. "You're educated," Caspian observed, as she quoted from Shakespeare. "More than most men in these parts. My mother was a teacher before she married. She made sure I could read and write, said education was the one thing no one could take away from a blah woman. She was right." His eyes held a new respect. "You're wasted in servant's work, Ophelia. You should be running your own household, raising children who inherit your intelligence and grace." The comment hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to voice. But that evening, as they sat together on the porch, Nightly ritual, now Caspian, reached for her hand without hesitation. "I need to tell you something," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, "about why you really came here." Ophelia's heart skipped. "What do you mean? Your father's dead, it was fabricated. Pemberton convinced some corrupt officials to seize you when your mother died, planning to sell you from the start." His jaw tightened with anger. "I knew it was fraudulent when I bought you. I've been investigating, gathering evidence to clear your name and prosecute the bastards responsible." The revelation stunned her. You knew I was innocent. I knew you didn't deserve what was happening to you." His storm gray eyes held hers steadily. "But I was too selfish to let you go immediately. I told myself I was protecting you. But the truth is, I needed you here. Needed something beautiful and good in this empty house." Ophelia felt tears prick her eyes. "So I'm free to leave? You've been free to leave for weeks?" Caspian said softly. "I just hoped you wouldn't want to." She studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide. This powerful, dangerous man was afraid I would choose freedom over staying with him. Where would I go? "I have no family, no money, no prospects." "You have me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If you want me. If you can love a broken man who's finally learned how to live again." Ophelia's answer was to lean across the space between their chairs and kiss him softly, tasting coffee, and hope on his lips. When they broke apart, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you, Ophelia," he whispered against her forehead. "God help me. I love you more than I ever thought possible." "And I love you, Caspian Ironwood," she replied, feeling her heart full to bursting. "All of you, the broken parts and the healing ones." Under the star-filled sky, the giant cowboy who had taken her as a slave held the woman who had melted his frozen heart. Both of them finally understanding that love was worth any risk. 6 months later, the same church that had witnessed 100 years of weddings had never seen anything quite like the ceremony uniting Caspian Ironwood and Ophelia Whitmore, her true surname, discovered during Caspian's investigation into her past. The entire county had turned out, partly for the spectacle of seeing the notorious recluse finally emerge from his self-imposed exile, but mostly because everyone loved a redemption story. Ophelia stood before the altar in a gown of white silk, in French lace, her chestnut hair crowned with wildflowers from the meadow where Caspian had first told her he loved her. At 6'8", her groom towered over everyone in the church, but his storm-gray eyes held only tenderness as he watched his bride approach. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Jeremiah began, his voice carrying easily through the packed church, "we gather today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other not just love, but redemption." Caspian's hands trembled slightly as he took Ophelia's smaller ones in his massive palms. The contrast was striking her delicate fingers against his work-roughened skin, but they fit together perfectly, as if they'd been designed for each other. "I never thought I'd stand here again," he murmured, his voice meant only for her ears. "Never thought I deserved another chance at happiness." "We all deserve love," Ophelia whispered back, her amber eyes bright with tears of joy. "Especially those who've learned how precious it truly is." The ceremony proceeded with traditional vows. But when Pastor Jeremiah asked if they had personal words to share, Caspian cleared his throat and spoke from his heart. "Ophelia, you came into my life when I was more beast than man, when I'd forgotten how to feel anything but anger and grief. You saw past the monster I'd become to the man I could be again. You taught me that healing isn't about forgetting the past, it's about finding the courage to build a future." His voice broke slightly. "You gave me back my humanity, and I promise to spend every day of our lives together proving worthy of that gift." There wasn't a dry eye in the church when Ophelia responded, her clear voice carrying to every corner.